Is AMD bad at ray tracing? I mean, if you listen to people online, myself included, then you'll know that we love the AMD graphics cards when it comes to price to performance, the amount of VRAM that you get inside them, and the performance in multiplayer titles and anything that we call rasterized without these fancy RTX ray traced effects. But it's got me thinking, is second best actually bad? We'll be looking at a whole bunch of different resolutions, different games, different settings to probably put this question to the test. And no cheating on this one, but you guys are actually part of the experiment, because I want you to comment down below, without looking at what anyone else has said just yet, whether you think the ray tracing experience on this is gonna be good, or maybe it's crap. Let's put that to the test and actually start our testing right after a short word from this video sponsor. Corsair's brand new 6500 series of cases have arrived, bringing beauty and the beastly airflow. This mighty enclosure has space for ginormous GPUs, thick radiators and coolers, and up to a whopping 10 PC fans. And thanks to its dual chamber design, building really is a breeze, as it's super easy to get a stunning looking PC. It comes in black or white, airflow mesh or timeless glass, and you can even swap out panels for optional wooden finishes. Learn more today with the link down below. Testing this out should actually be fairly straightforward. We've gone for a 7800 X3D. I mean, we have, that's in there, that's force of habit. The CPU is a 7800 X3D. We're gonna keep everything nice and open. We've got a nice cooler on there, so the bottleneck is very much gonna be on the 7800 XT graphics card, pretty much because this is mid-range, and this is one of those key examples really, where I think the AMD option is actually better than nvidia if you specifically don't care about ray tracing, because the competing RTX 4070 doesn't have the same amount of VRAM, it's got 12, but it's also more expensive, and in a lot of games it won't perform as well. So clearly this is a no-brainer, other than the ray tracing. And the first game that I want to test is probably the most important, because obviously this is like the big nvidia title, it's the one that sort of got everyone properly into ray tracing. Whoa! I haven't had bugs in this game actually for ages. That is the first one I've seen in a while. Why did I blow up as well? That's very strange. But slightly weird and wacky game logic aside, this is obviously one of the most important ray trace titles we have, and there's no doubt about it that if you were playing this game, you've just got a brand new gaming PC, I think it would be fair to say that you'd be pretty disappointed if you couldn't at least try the ray tracing settings. But as we know, as soon as we turn it on, the frame rate will drop. And when we're currently getting around about 48 frames a second, albeit at 4K with FSR, then obviously we don't really have the scope to turn that on at the moment anyway. And this is going to be the same on an nvidia card. Obviously it depends on the class. This is why I said we went for something mid-range, to sort of show you the real world limitations, because if we do go into the settings now and we turn ray tracing on, here it is, there's a few different sliders we can use. We'll go for everything I think at the moment, although we set that to medium. We'll exit out of it, and the game kind of gets a bit upset and confused before running, but now at around about 25 frames a second. And you don't need the latency counter for this one to know that this is not suitable. However, I would like to reiterate once again that we didn't have that raw frame rate in the first place. So again, if this was an nvidia card and we were getting 48 frames a second, if you turn ray tracing on, you might get slightly higher frame rate, but it's still not going to be where you want it. So what we're going to do is first change the resolution to 1440p. We'll then reload the same scene, and then what you should start to see is a very real world scenario of an AMD graphics card running the big nvidia game, but with ray tracing enabled. And I will very quickly say that if you're watching this on your either on an older generation AMD GPU, so 6000 series, or maybe you're looking at bagging yourself a bargain and getting something like a 6700 XT, then from my experience, these cards definitely don't work as well as the new 7000 series when it comes to ray tracing, but your mileage will definitely vary. But I do think that it is incredibly important that you do actually see this for yourself, because I just get a little bit annoyed sometimes when, you know, myself included, we sort of focus on graphs a little bit too much, and especially average frame rates and things like that. And we compare all of these different GPUs and we almost forget to actually see what the product we're interested in can actually produce. And I think this is really impressive. I mean, the latency is slightly above where I would like it to be. We want around about 55 milliseconds or less, and we're currently hovering at about 55 to 62, but I will say that we are actually recording, and I think we're doing this in AV1, so there's probably like a 3 to 5 millisecond overhead just from recording. So actually, I would say if I was going to play Cyberpunk, I would probably choose these exact settings, to be fair. Obviously, you can customize it a little bit more if you do want to go into the settings. Maybe we want to change this to Ultra, for instance. Will that make that much of a difference to our latency? Let's have a look. Not massively. The frame rate's still about the same, and to be fair, the latency has actually gone down, but as we've sort of alluded to, it depends where you are in the game. The more sort of RTX lighting effects and the more rays and things that do have to be reflected, refracted, whatever it is in the scene, obviously that is going to cause you a latency penalty. You can now start to see that climb as we go into the city a little bit more. But I don't see any reason, if you're playing on a 1440p display with this exact rig, why you would want to turn the ray tracing off. I mean, I guess it is for higher frame rates. And what is the difference going to be? Well, that's what, like 50% more? We're now looking around about 95, 100 frames a second, and it certainly feels a lot smoother. Our latency is pretty much halved. But again, this is a story game, and even if you are playing on an nvidia GPU, you are still going to have to choose between having a higher frame rate or that full ray trace experience. Now, where this is going to fall apart is if you want to do like extreme ray tracing, and this is the, I don't want to say dodgy because that's potentially a little bit unfair, but should we say sometimes misleading graphs nvidia put out when they're like 3 times the performance versus the last generation. But they're actually testing ray tracing set to the highest preset possible, which is this thing called path tracing. We'll turn this on now, and I'm expecting a woefully bad experience here. And indeed, yes, that is what we're getting. I mean, this is completely unplayable, and this is one of those examples where if you did have an nvidia GPU, it would perform better. I mean, 115 milliseconds of latency, 22 frames a second. This is going to be great if you want to use photo mode. There's no reason you couldn't do that. But this is one of those examples where nvidia will definitely have it beat. But I would still say that the 4070, which is the card in this class that would be competing against, I still wouldn't use that with path tracing enabled unless it was set to 1080p. So just because it would be better, it doesn't still mean you would want to actually play with it. That makes sense? But obviously it can't all be about Cyberpunk. I mean, that would get pretty boring, and in fact, I think my favorite ray trace title, bar maybe Alan Wake that we're testing just a bit, is Returnal, because this is a game that looks absolutely fantastic with the tech enabled, but then it's also one that doesn't have the most like intense requirements out there. So even on AMD Arc, I was still able to get this to run with some light ray tracing enabled at very playable settings in a way that I would actually want to use. But what you're seeing here is set to Epic, ray tracing disabled at 1440p, as we do need our baseline. That is annoying. I've got this set to like hard. Let's do something I struggle with for a second and actually stand still. We're getting 153 frames a second and then 24 milliseconds of latency whilst recording. We're now going to go into the settings and once again enable our ray tracing. FSR is set to quality, by the way. Here we go. Ray trace shadows, we set that to high. Ray trace reflections, we also set that to high. And then what has that done to the frame rate? Well, it's definitely gone down. Again, no matter what your PC is at the time of filming, until some super GPU comes out with, I don't know, like ridiculous ray tracing hardware built in, you are always going to lose some frames per second. And here, I mean, it is obviously dramatic. I mean, again, it's almost what? 40% or so of your frame rate gone. And when you say it like that, it makes it sound really scary, it's bad. But fundamentally, as long as you're still getting the frame rate that you're happy with, it doesn't really matter too much. Because we're still getting 110 frames a second here, and our latency is a phenomenal 33 milliseconds. But for what most people are actually going to do, which is to play and enjoy this single player game, then you're not really making a compromise here that matters. I mean, yes, it is a lower frame rate, but as you can clearly see, we're still getting really high numbers. I mean, it is going to depend where you are in the game, and when you get to like a boss sequence and there's loads of particles and things, yes, the frame rate will get lower. But once again, this is another instance where if I was choosing to actually play on this system and play Returnal, then yeah, I would happily have the ray tracing off. I mean, it'd be interesting to see how the nvidia cards fare on this, but even if it's better, I'm not really seeing much of a problem right now. And I realise I forgot to introduce the next title. Things have got a bit frantic. This is some Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, and this is currently, well, pretty much the same as everything else really. 1440p, set to very high, no ray tracing, and we do have FSR set to quality. Game looks really nice, it's running really well. This is a direct storage title, so if you do decide to, well, lose, you can reload very, very quickly, which is nice. But our frame rate at the moment is pretty impressive, around about 120 frames a second. We don't have latency figures for this exact title though. But anyway, let's proceed to actually turn our ray tracing on, and reflections at high. Once again, the game kind of freaks out. This is common. So we go medium on that, and ambient occlusion, medium. Okay, so high, medium, medium. Is this going to be playable? Yes! Yes, it is, once again. Okay. I'm genuinely really, really impressed. I hate to admit it, but I think I have been a little bit harsh on AMD recently when it comes to ray tracing. Because as you can clearly see, this is able to handle it. I mean, pretty much, as long as you've got around about, what, 60 to 80 frames a second in a single player title, you're gonna be really happy. And so far, every single game we've tested it has managed it. I mean, 4K was way too much for this poor little thing to handle, but if you're not playing at 4K, then it doesn't really matter. I mean, you haven't lost that many frames here. What's that? We've lost about maybe 20 FPS or so. It's a shame we're not getting the latency readout, but I have to admit, I'm really impressed here. And because I didn't expect things to be going as well as they were, I have actually downloaded an older, or one of the more original titles to test ray tracing. This is Control. Now, this doesn't actually have any FSR, which would be a bit of a bummer, but these days, to be honest, all the games that do have DLSS pretty much do have XeSS or FSR, so the whole upscaling thing to get a higher frame rate is not really that much of an issue anymore. Whereas in Control, I guess, potentially it is. But we're still getting around about 115, 105 frames a second or so running at a render resolution of 1440 without the upscaler. But I am keen to actually see what happens when we turn ray tracing on. Is it going to work better or worse than an older title? We set this to high, which means everything becomes enabled. Exit out of that. Once again, the game does like have a bit of a freak out. This is normal, annoyingly, so don't worry too much if that happens to you. And then we can see how everything performs. Yes, this is actually a prime example of what I was expecting to happen in pretty much all of the titles, where the frame rate has actually dropped in half. And I'm not sure whether this is just a earlier implementation, whether it's not as efficient, or whether the GPU itself isn't able to handle it as well as the newer games. But yes, this would annoy you because you've gone from arguably having a bit too much in the way of FPS to now not quite having enough, around about 50, 55 frames a second or so. So this would be one of those examples where I would actually turn the ray tracing down. I think just some of the lighter settings would make more sense. But this is one of those games where it really does look pretty stunning, actually. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily like the end of the world if you can't play this with the ray tracing enabled, but it's definitely one of those titles, I think, that does stand out and really does look a little bit more special. But while Control is definitely a game that is worth checking out, I would highly advise, if you haven't played it yet, you turn your attention to this, Alan Wake 2, because this is actually my favorite implementation of ray tracing yet, as this is a game, as you can see, that's very dark, it's very moody, and it's literally all about light. So by having a PC that can actually have better lighting, clearly it's not only going to be noticeable, but it is going to make a decent difference to your overall experience. And I know a lot of people say, ugh.
Better experience because you've got ray tracing. Give over.
I get it. Obviously the gameplay, the frame rate, story, all of those things are definitely more important. But point being, there are some games where ray tracing, things, you know, like Fortnite, is completely stupid and irrelevant. It's a multiplayer game. Why would you turn this on and lose frame rate? It doesn't make any sense. Whereas in a game like Alan Wake or Returnal, where it does just make the whole game world just look so much better and it's more immersive, I don't know, it just is better. That's a good thing, and you do want to turn ray tracing on if you can. I mean, just look how dark this game is. I mean, this is without the ray tracing, and to be fair, it still definitely does look pretty good. Our frame rate is sky high at the moment. Once again, 1440p FSR quality, but you will see as soon as we turn on the ray tracing, things will get quite a lot better. Other than the frame rate, I'm not expecting wonders here. Latency at the moment is about 20 to 35 milliseconds or so, and I can pretty much guarantee as soon as we turn it on, it's It's not going to be that anymore. So once again, let's head over to the graphics options. We'll find our ray tracing preset, and we're going to set this to medium, I think, for now. We'll try high in just a second. Oh, that is a lower frame rate now, isn't it? And this isn't even the most intense bit of the game. That is, that's fine. I mean, especially at the moment where you're sort of just moving around very slowly, it's definitely not the end of the world. But I think it's definitely fair to say that the frame rate here is going to be more noticeable than the extra visual quality than you're going to get from the ray tracing. I mean, it does look great. Even in a dark tunnel, the ray tracing is pretty tasty. But I mean, to be fair, the latency still does pass my sniff test. This isn't a case of if it's 56 milliseconds, suddenly throw it in the bin, it's bad. Literally anything under 55 milliseconds, in my opinion, for a single player game is good. Like, I played this game all the way through. As we've already discussed, I'm a big fan of ray tracing when it works, and in a title like this, it does make a big difference, but I'd still argue that, having a much higher frame rate still is more important when it's such a dramatic drop. But this is really intense when it comes to ray tracing. So actually, I do want to see what happens at the lower quality. Ray tracing low. And actually, that has made a massive difference. I'd argue this is now how you're going to want to play. I mean, you don't need more frame rate than this. It's a very slow-paced game, even if you're using a mouse and keyboard. And yeah, around about 80 frames a second, latency 33 milliseconds, so plenty in the tank, and you are going to be getting a better looking game. But what if you want the best looking game? Ray tracing high. I reckon we're going to drop to 35 frames a second. Let's have a look. No, it is higher than I thought. It's only 44 frames a second now, but yeah, there wouldn't really be any point using this when you're getting 60 milliseconds of latency and your frame rate is below 50. It's just not worth it. So I think we've proven at this stage that the AMD card is actually very capable, but in order to actually properly understand how it competes, we do of course need to now swap over to the nvidia card, this being the 4070. It is a dual version from Palette, so this is trying to be as RRP as possible. They have come down in price quite a lot, but I still haven't seen one for anywhere near the same price as the 7800 XT. You're looking for maybe 40, 50 pounds here in the UK to get one of these, and obviously you are losing 4 gigabytes of VRAM, which if it wasn't for the NVIDIA features, would definitely make this a tough sell. Let's drop this into our rig, fire up a game, and then really importantly, we're going to run the same games at the exact same settings to see what sort of difference we can get. And it's very interesting because this really does sort of prove the point, if you like, because we're getting around about 62 to 64 frames a second in Cyberpunk with the exact same settings, whereas on the AMD card that does cost less, we were getting about 50. But very importantly, it's worth remembering that while the NVIDIA card is more expensive, it's not even 10% more expensive, whereas here we're getting around about 20% extra performance. But it doesn't stop there because this is using FSR, whereas if we were actually going to be doing this properly, then you'd use DLSS because it's higher quality, which means you can either get a better looking image, or of course you can turn it down a little bit, which means rendering at a lower resolution, which will give you an even higher frame rate. In addition to the fact you also get DLSS 3 frame generation, which not everyone likes because it's fake frames, and actually, to be fair, on the 4070 I find it doesn't work nearly as well as it does on the 4070 Ti and up, but it's still something that's definitely worth using if you have a decent frame rate to begin with, because it means your overall image will look a fair bit smoother, as long as you're paying attention to the fact that the latency can increase, you keep it under the 55 millisecond mark, you're going to be getting a better experience. But is it that much better? Do you see what I mean, by the way, about frame gen? Even at 1440p DLSS balanced on the 4070, if you do enable the tech, while the frame rate is now around about 110 FPS, our latency is still over 55 milliseconds at around about 60 to 67, which means it can be a useful feature, but still, this is too high and I wouldn't want to use it. Not on this particular title and settings anyway. Returning to our next title, Returnal yields similar but not quite as dramatic results, as we went from 99 frames a second on the 7800 XT to 106 on the 4070. But of course, again, this is another title that you could use frame generation or super resolution to yield potentially better image quality or a higher frame rate. And then last, but certainly not least, the most intense game I think we tested, some Alan Wake 2. And once again, this isn't like a crazy sky-high frame rate, but at the Ray Tracing High preset, we have seen quite a substantial boost to the FPS, as we're now looking at around about 52 frames a second in the exact same spot at Ray Tracing High. The latency is is what I'd say is at borderline fine. If it peaked above this, then it would be annoying, so I'd probably turn down to ray tracing low. But with 52 frames a second in a slow-paced game like this, absolutely fine. Whether you want 52 frames a second or you want to turn it down, that's entirely up to you. But if I turn to my magic notepad that I recorded these results earlier, then the AMD graphics card was only getting 44 frames a second and 62 milliseconds of latency. So realistically, I think pretty much everyone would turn the ray tracing off or down on that AMD card, whereas here we are getting a playable experience. It's not perfect, but once again, this does prove that if you want to do ray tracing, nvidia clearly comes out on top. Well then everybody, I think you will agree with me when I say I should have actually got this desk ready before I started this bit. No, I think you'll agree with me that actually we've had some really interesting results, and actually seeing the gameplay firsthand rather than just relying on graphs has made a massive difference, because my overall impression of the 7800 XT and I guess the ray tracing experience on this particular AMD graphics card is better than expected, and we've shown that in the titles that you probably want to turn it on, things like your Returnal, well, even Alan Wake 2 on low, that was fine, Cyberpunk, all of that good stuff. You're actually able to not only get a passable experience, but a very good one. Yes, you are going to lose frames per second, but at the end of the day, how much does this matter if you're still sort of hitting that baseline of what a good experience is? And you always have the choice, you don't have to turn it on if you really don't care about ray tracing, fine. But I think if you are just going to look at like raw FPS numbers with all of the image scalers and things turned off and ray tracing at the max, I do think it does AMD a bit of a disservice really, because it's not actually that bad. In fact, I would say that the ray tracing experience on this, especially compared to what you have to put up with on console, where it's usually locked to 30, is great. I mean, if you can get over 60 frames a second with ray tracing in a lot of titles and great latency, why wouldn't you use it? And this is exactly why I asked you guys to actually comment earlier in the video before we saw all of the results, because I suspected, myself included, that we probably didn't think the AMD card would be as good as it is. And obviously, yes, there are things like DLSS 3 frame generation that can make a massive difference. This is why we sort of clearly label it when we use it in our graphs. I don't believe that there are features that you shouldn't or should use. I think it's always going to be up to the end user. But the main thing really is that if you are going to be turning any high intensity settings on, or things like frame generation, be it from AMD or of course from nvidia, always pay very close attention to the latency, because if your game doesn't feel right, doesn't matter what the frame rate counter says it is, if you can get 55 milliseconds or less, I think you're golden. If not, maybe consider turning some of the settings down. But the question very much goes out to you guys on this one. Were you right? Were you wrong? And does this actually change your opinion or perspective on these AMD graphics cards? Once again, it is going to depend on the exact one that you go for, especially something like a 7600 is not going to be great for ray tracing, whereas something like the XTX clearly is going to be better than this. But yeah, let us know down in the comment section below. Smash this like button if you've enjoyed it, really helps out. Get yourself subscribed, and as always, if you do want to check out current pricing on anything that was featured in this video, you can find it listed down below with our affiliate links. And while you're down there, why not bask in the bonanza of the Corsair 6500 series of cases? These stunning new chassis take your build to the next level, with support for cooling at the top, bottom, rear and side, in addition to showing your PC parts in their best light. It's dual chamber, so getting a tidy build is easy. There are 4 USB-As and a Type-C, and you can even get the front panel in mesh airflow or luxurious glass. Upgrade today with the link down below. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. We'll catch you in the next one.